Experienced trappers became silent as the footprints revealed a tail. Each toe mark is pressed deeply for 4 feet into the snow of February. At daylight, the bear had passed through the edge of the camp, near enough for its breath to have obscured the closest shelter's canvas, near enough to kill. However, the men weren't staring for that reason. What those tracks led to halted talk, directly to the improbable death trap that everyone warned about wouldn't function. Those same men had laughed 3 weeks before. The green was heavily blanketed by the winter of 1829, River Valley and the Rocky Mountains, as trappers referred to them. Contemporary geography would put this in the state of Wyoming today. However, in 1829, it was just the wilds, a location where, between 1820 and 1840, around 3,000 mountain men roamed the areas in search of beavers. Back in St. Louis, the pelts were valuable for their weight and wealth. By the end of January, the majority of winter quarters had been set up for trapping brigades. These camps were scattered throughout the game-remaining protected valleys, abundant and capable of withstanding the most severe storms. By now, the pattern was firmly set in the fur trade period. When beaver pelts grew during the fall hunt, which ran from September to December, trappers put in a lot of work, hefty for the winter. The harsh months of January and February followed, during which even the strongest men congregated in anticipation of the spring thaw, which would herald the trapping season from March to May. Season. In the Rockies, however, winter was never a time to relax. In a normal winter camp, there were between 20 and 50 men, split between camp keepers and trappers. The cooks were the camp keepers, processing beaver pelts, producing leather thongs, keeping equipment in good condition, and protecting the herd of horses. The trappers took turns performing these tasks, but on days when it was milder, they also went hunting or checking trap lines for meat. That winter, the camp at Green River was governed loosely by individuals who had acquired their skills from the Rocky Mountain. Fur Company was founded by Andrew Henry and William Ashley. By 1829, these were mountain men of the second generation, men who had lived long enough to understand their art and the risks involved. Among them was Warren Blackwood, such a man, even if the renowned fur trade publications never mentioned him by name. He reached the mountainous region in the enticed westward by St. Louis newspaper ads in the spring of 1825 that called for ambitious young men who are prepared to labor for about $200 a year. He had been 22 years old and yearning for something beyond of the refined boundaries of Missouri towns. After 4 years in, he had learned what no ad said from the mountains: that the most dangerous animals were grizzly bears. In North America, that winter had the same potential for death as any Blackfoot war party. The formerly seemingly endless streams were becoming more devoid of those beavers, and it took constant creativity to survive. Over the winter, the grizzly situation had gotten worse. Grizzly, it was believed that bears would hibernate. All trappers were aware of that. As fall turned into winter, the enormous bears came into eating continuously to increase fat stores at a time known as hyperphagia. During this time, a grizzly might gain up to 5 pounds per day by eating 45 pounds of food every day. Next, as temperatures fell and snow gathered, the bears withdrew to their excavated dens on slopes that face north, typically at heights higher than 5,000 feet. Snow insulated their grizzlies invaded torpor, forming a pile that might reach several feet deep above the den entrance. Ground-based hibernation is not the same as bats or squirrels, but a profound sleep state in which heart rates decreased from 40 to as low as 8 beats per minute, and body temperature went down a little. Depending on the severity of their conditions, they would spend 4 to 7 months in their dens. The bears stayed in the winter. That was the trend. The trappers relied on that. However, not all bears adhered to the pattern. In the fall, male grizzlies, especially big, powerful males, tended to reach their densest and appeared first in the spring. Additionally, some bears, particularly during the winter when food had never fully committed to denning, but had been plentiful in the fall or in years with variable temperatures, they entered a state of walking hibernation, as one contemporary biologist would subsequently refer to it: slow-moving and lazy, but still risky but active. Since the middle of January, the Green River camp has been battling this kind of bear. The first indication appeared when a camp keeper saw horse traces that led out of the area where the herd was picketing. Tracing the path through, he discovered the remains of a sorrel mare 200 yards into the woods in the early snow. After killing her with a single strike that broke her neck, the grizzly proceeded to feed on the carcass for the number of hours indicated on the track. Horses were a measure of affluence for mountain people. transported horses, traded products, transported beaver pelts, and made the difference between being able to move around and getting stuck in a hostile territory. In St. Louis, a fur trapper's horse was valued about $100, almost a company man's salary for half a year. The defeat was detrimental both practically and monetary. Hunters from the camp headed out to find the bear. They discovered its path with ease. With all 5 toes, the grizzly's tracks were recognizable and enormous, markings that are discernible in soft soil or snow. The front paw is between 10 and 12 inches long and 7 to 8 inches in diameter. An additional 3 to 4 deep punctures were added by the claws, before the pad markings. After 6 miles of following the bear, they lost sight of it as it moved into a rocky region that the snow had been carried away by the wind. Nobody proposed to carry on the hunt. Grizzly. In the 1820s, mountain men realized that, with the weapons at their disposal, bears were practically hard to kill. The A50 or 54 caliber flintlock rifle was the standard weapon, sufficiently correct, although needing a precise shot to hit key spots in order to take down a 600-900 pound bear. A bear that was injured was more hazardous than one that isn't disturbed. In rugged terrain, the bear could cover ground more quickly than a horse, reaching up to 30 mph in brief spurts. The bear returned to camp 3 days later. It didn't require a horse at the time. It just strolled past the camp at what appeared to be midnight based on the snow evidence, moving between shelters that are close enough to allow sleeping men to be easily struck. It was an obvious message. The bear had discovered that feeding horses, refuse, and preserved meat were associated with human encampment. This was an issue for which there was no simple fix. To shoot the bear, a dedicated hunt had to be planned, which required dragging men away from necessary winter labor. It implied that mountain men saw grizzly encounters as a fabled way to end terribly. Many deaths were recorded in the diaries of the time. 1823, by themselves, Jedediah Smith and Hugh Glass had escaped savage attacks that should murdered them, while other guys were not that lucky. Steel traps wouldn't be effective. The most robust trap produced in this era was the 5th Newhouse. Specifically made for black bears, it had a jaw span of 11 and 3/4 inches and weighed about 19 pounds. For the number 6 was manufactured by Grizzlies and weighed 42 pounds with a 16-inch the jaw dropped. It was dubbed the Great Bear Tamer by modern trappers. However, even though there were serious issues with number 6. Initially, not many trappers brought such large traps into the highlands. The mass was prohibitive when supplies in beaver traps were valued at 1 pound. Secondly, a grizzly could frequently snap the chain or pull the trap free even after it was caught. Third, it is necessary to set such a trap. Knowledge that may result in a man's death if the bear showed up before the trap was securely hidden. In actuality, mountain men stayed away from grizzlies. When they passed through places where bears might be present, they made noise. Be rejected. They prevented food waste in the camps. They believed trappers would be left alone and bears would remain in their dens. However, this bear refused to cooperate. 4 days following its nocturnal patrol, it made a third appearance. This time it was demolished. A trapline. A series of beaver sets have been kept up to date by Warren Blackwood. A spring that kept water flowing even in the winter protected a brook from freezing. Long winter. Potential revenue was indicated by these sets. Has anyone caught a beaver? Was an advantage during the lean months in the winter. The trapline was discovered by the Grizzly, who systematically demolished it. 6 traps that were removed from their sets. 4 were irreparably broken, twisted by what had to be a powerful force. The bait was taken. Now the message was even more obvious. The bears were actively interfering with the tasks that kept mountain folk alive, not just being there. That night, Warren Blackwood offered a suggestion while seated around a fire constructed inside the biggest shelter that produced trappers give a headshake. There was silence when he spoke. A deadfall, big enough for a grizzly. Wasn't given due respect. It was the quiet of men listening to someone they had assumed was stupid say something was more intelligent. For millennia, people had been using death traps. The idea was straightforward. A large weight hanging over the ground, secured by a trigger system. When an animal reached for bait and tampered with the trigger, the animal was crushed as the weight fell. Ancient technology known as death falls dates back hundreds or possibly thousands of years. Years. They were frequently employed by mountain men for marten, beaver, and other small animals. A grizzly's death fall, however, in winter. The complaints came quickly. One man would freeze the logs to the ground. Stated, timber cannot be moved in this snow. There isn't a single grizzly that would stick its head under a... They're not fools, he continued. And if it doesn't kill the bear clean, a third man said. Then you have a wounded grizzly that is aware of the particular person who set the trap. These were serious issues. They were the collected knowledge of men who were aware of both traps and bears. Blackwood listened without interjecting, and after the objections were exhausted, he said in a low voice, stating his position. Since the bear was active, it wasn't totally dedicated to denning. Required sustenance. The horse murder demonstrated that the bear will explore anything that could supply calories. The bear would be attracted to baited deadfall. As for construction, it was feasible. Yes, it was challenging. Time-consuming, certainly, but feasible. The fundamentals weren't difficult. What was needed was scale and meticulous engineering. There was a genuine risk of a bear getting hurt, but the risk of allowing this bear to continue learning that the camp offered convenient food was also high. Eventually, it would murder a man. A bear that chose to attack a sleeping trapper had no protection. Humans were the prey. The argument was persuasive, if possibly not solely based on reason. Blackwood wasn't requesting assistance, and mountain men valued action over words. He was outlining his plan, inviting anyone who want to help. If not, he had made an effort. 3 men volunteered on their own, either because they genuinely believed in the plan or it didn't really matter, just plain monotony in an unending winter. Work started the following morning. Position was important, and Blackwood picked a position along the route 200 yards from camp. The area provided a number of benefits, including mature timber growing thick, which the grizzly had employed during its nightly visit. Enough to supply building materials. They wouldn't have to clear away dense underbrush because of a natural clearing. Since the location could be seen from the camp, they could watch from a distance in case the trap was set. Deadfall. Choosing the drop log was the first step in the construction process because size was important and weight would determine the killing. A log that was 4 feet long and 8 inches in diameter was adequate for tiny animals. Crushing force. The requirements significantly increased for a grizzly. They required a wood that was large enough to instantaneously kill a 600-pound bear without hurting it. Instead, catch it. Kill it completely, then crush its critical organs and chest cavity before the bear can respond. In order to provide enough weight, the approach suggested constructing the trap with several logs placed on top of one another. However, a new strategy was required in deep snow with frozen ground and restricted mobility. Thus, Blackwood suggested utilizing a standing, dead pine tree that had fallen during a fall storm. It had worn to a gray hardness of 14 after dying years previously. It was 30 feet long, with a base diameter of in, and it rested at an angle against other trees, one of which is 4 feet above the ground, the other is covered in snow, and it appeared difficult to move the frozen dirt. So the crew spent a whole day using knives and trade axes to chip away at the frozen soil. Mountain men excavated around the hidden end, when small, portable instruments weighing 2 to 3 pounds were invented, compared to the strenuous task of logging. Inches were used to assess progress. By the second, after releasing the log base that day, they encountered a new challenge. 4 men were unable to raise a 14-inch pine log 30 feet long. Even if they could, transporting it to the chosen trap through deep snow location posed difficulties that were beyond the scope of raw force and methods that went back centuries. They made levers by cutting 20-foot poles out of live timber. Near the high end of the log, they constructed a rudimentary tripod structure using normal trapper rope from buffalo hide. Apparatus for fastening burdens to pack horses in order to increase their lifting capacity through a pulley system. Took 4 days, 4 days of snow, and 4 days of cold that turned breath into ice crystals, that fell periodically, necessitating continuous cleanup of the work area. 4 days of strenuous work that left muscles. Despite wearing buffalo hide gloves, the hands were still raw and shaking on the afternoon of the 4th day. They had transported the enormous log to the trap location and placed it just where Blackwood requested. The building they constructed adhered to the guidelines outlined in trapping guides that would be released decades later, but which existed as a common understanding among trap-working guys. The design was known as a pole deadfall. Massive in size, the base was made up of 2 8-inch parallel timbers, in diameter, spaced 4 feet apart and 6 feet long. These were cross pieces across the parallel logs provided a stable platform, and they were partially buried in snow to keep them stable. At one end of the base construction was the drop log, the enormous pine that they had moved with such effort. The end was held in place by a trigger mechanism and raised 4 feet off the ground. The crucial element was the trigger, which needed to be stable enough not to release when disturbed, but sensitive enough to drop too soon. It needed to be sturdy enough to support a lot of weight, but built to fail. Blackwood employed a trigger design known as the prop and spindle, which activated quickly when the proper pressure was applied. 3 parts made up this mechanism: a vertical prop that supported the drop log's higher end, a horizontal. The prop was a sturdy piece of material that was supported by a spindle and connected to it with a bait stick. Wood that was cut precisely such that the drop log balanced at the edge when it was set. Of stability. A smaller component called the spindle was positioned in slots carved into the bait stick stretched forward, and 2 vertical stakes were pushed deeply into the frozen ground on either side of the trap. From beneath the spindle's drop log, the physics were beautiful. As an animal tugged on the bait stick, it rotated the spindle, which caused the notch on the spindle to separate from the prop. The animal beneath the log perished when the prop fell and the drop log fell. It was easy on paper, but in reality, setting the trigger needed nerve that most men lacked. Therefore, someone had to, while someone else positioned the trigger pieces, hold the drop log up so that if anything slipped, the man underneath the log would be crushed in precisely the same way that they planned to destroy the Grizzly. They used a smaller log. They set and released it 10 times until all the men understood his function and the necessary movement pattern. Only then did they try using the 14-inch drop log to lay the actual trap. Blackwood insisted on being the man beneath the log during the last set, did not want to be held accountable if something went wrong. Instead of witnessing another guy die for his idea, the moment seemed to last longer than it did.